So hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. And I want to give a special thank you to our sign language interpreters, Brandon and Gregorio, for being here. We will drop their contact information in the chat in case you're interested in reaching out to them for interpretation for your own events. And we also just wanted to let folks know that you can turn on closed captioning if you want to by clicking, it should be at the bottom in theory, by clicking live transcript and then show subtitles. So before we jump in, we wanted to first take a moment to acknowledge and name the original caretakers of the land that Erica and I are calling in from. So I am in super sunny today, Tacoma Park, Maryland, which is the land of the Piscataway people. And Erica is calling in from DC, which is the land of the Anacostans. And so, we think that it's really important to always keep in mind the reality that we're all living and operating and functioning on stolen land. And then also, as restorative justice practitioners, as we discussed during our last webinar, our work is grounded in Indigenous practices and ways of being in community. So we like to honor the fact that, this isn't something that, Erica and I or our team just came up with. These are practices that Indigenous people from all over the world have engaged in for centuries. So as we open things up, we would like to invite folks to introduce yourselves in the chat, and if possible, let us know who the original caretakers are of the land that you're joining us from. All right, so as folks are introducing themselves, we will introduce ourselves. So my name is Sia Henry. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a senior program specialist with the Restorative Justice Project at Impact Justice. So I'm an attorney with a background in doing prison and jail conditions of confinement work. And I come to restorative justice with a really deep love for and hope for liberation of the Black community. And I will let Erica introduce herself.
Thanks, Sia. Hi, everyone. My name is Erica Washington. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a senior program associate on the Restorative Justice Project team at Impact Justice. And so what that really means is that I support with Sia communities around the country to implement restorative justice diversion programs in their specific counties. So prior to joining Impact Justice, I helped to build a restorative justice program in North Carolina. And I also, while there, practiced capital defense law. And then through using a number of the tools that Impact Justice has developed for communities to implement those programs within the community I was living, I was connected to Impact Justice and have been working with this team for about a year now. So excited to be here with all of you today, and I'll go ahead and turn it back to Sia.
Thanks, Erica. Okay, so a couple weeks ago, some other members of our team gave a kind of like initial webinar that was an introduction to restorative justice. So today, this webinar will be an introduction to our unique model of pre-charge restorative justice diversion. So you have our learning objectives up on the screen here. So we're hoping that by the end of our time together, you will have had a chance to review the principles of restorative justice, gain an understanding of how pre-charged restorative justice diversion works, and then also understand the elements of our restorative justice diversion model. And then as a quick note, we are hoping to have about 15 or so minutes at the end of our hour-long time together to answer as many questions as possible. So, feel free to drop questions in the chat as we go. Bree, who's our super awesome helper today, who will be kind of collecting all those questions for us to try to get to as many of those at the end of this webinar as possible. So before we kind of jump into the heart of talking about restorative justice and restorative justice diversion, we wanted to work through a kind of quick exercise. So we would like to invite everyone to take a moment to think about a time that you were harmed. And it doesn't have to be, the worst thing that's ever happened to you. Please don't share what the actual harm was in the chat. But think about a time that you were harmed, and then think about the needs that came out of that harm. So think about the needs from a time that you were harmed. And feel free to drop some of those needs in the chat now. So again, we're thinking about needs from a time that you were harmed.
So it looks like some are coming in. We have, I needed to be heard. I needed validation of the harm that happened, to tell someone how I had been harmed, to be fed and cared for. I needed fairness. I needed understanding, to feel safe, respected, empowered.
Awesome, thanks, Erica. Great, so then kind of switching gears a little bit, switching our focus, we now want to invite folks to think about a time that you've caused harm. Again, doesn't have to be the worst thing you've ever done, but think about a time that you've caused harm, and now think about the needs that came out of the time that you caused harm. And also feel free to drop those in the chat.
So we have one already from Kathy, a need to apologize. We have a need to be quiet and to listen. I see a need, let's see, a need to reflect on my behaviors, forgiveness, reassurance that I'm not bad or wicked. I needed to tell my perspective, to be given safe space to listen, to understand, to apologize. I needed to make it right, to take responsibility, to accept my wrong, to feel safe, to be honest, to forgive myself.
Perfect. Thanks so much again, Erica. Great. So, thank you all so much for your responses and participating in this super brief exercise. So we do this for a number of reasons. We ask these questions for a number of reasons. So the first reason is to highlight the reality that we have all been harmed at some point in our lives. And we've also all caused harm, right? So there's really no such thing as, a victim or an offender. We're all kind of all of the things all at once. Humanity is complicated, right? And so also we do this to just underscore the fact that needs arise from both of those experiences, not just from the times that we've been harmed. And so I'd also like us to look at the different sets of needs from both from being harmed and also from the times that we've caused harm. And I'd also like to invite folks to think about how these two lists of needs are different, how they compare, right? So where do you see similarities? And then also where do you see differences? And then taking a little bit of a further step back, do you think that our current criminal legal system meets any of these needs, right? And so then if so, which ones? So again, looking at those lists of needs, feel free to drop any thoughts in the chats. Which, if any of these needs, does our current criminal legal system address? And I'll pause for a second in case people have thoughts.
So I'm seeing none, it doesn't. I don't think it really deals with any of these needs, to be honest. None. I think we've identified the challenge here.
I agree. Thanks, Erica. So as you see the quote on the screen, as Dr. Mae Jameson, who's the first African-American female astronaut, said, never be limited by other people's limited imaginations. So a lot of what grounds the restorative justice work that we do focuses on encouraging people to think creatively about different ways of being in community with each other and not limiting our ideas to what has been done or even what we think might be possible or feasible, right? And so in doing that, though, we're not asking people to think about entirely new options and processes, right? We're not asking people to reinvent the wheel. And actually, the process that we're going to be talking about today isn't even necessarily new because we're not really here to teach you anything new, which I know is kind of a wild thing to say to people at the beginning of a webinar, but stick with us. So the idea here, though, is that we're here to remind you of what you already know, right? So as we just saw with the responses to the last two slides, and even just the responses in terms of asking about whether our current criminal legal system, addresses any of the needs that come out of harm, you all already know what you need to heal, both after you've been harmed and then also after you've caused harm. And for many of us, though, that knowing has essentially been warped by our exposure to our current criminal legal system. And that can be from our actual direct involvement with the system, from watching TV and movies and different things like that, or even just walking around our neighborhoods and seeing kind of the criminal legal system do its thing. So essentially, Erica and I are really just here today to invite folks to return to ourselves and just kind of remind ourselves of what we already know. So before we get into what restorative justice diversion is and what it can look like, we are going to start with a quick recap of what restorative justice is and the principles of restorative justice, especially for those who weren't able to make it to our last webinar on that introduction to restorative justice. So remember that restorative justice is first and foremost about relationships and ways that we create and nurture and mend those relationships, right? So in the context of addressing harm, and just as a reminder, restorative justice isn't just this program or a tool or a process for addressing harm, but because today we're exclusively talking about harm, in the context of addressing harm, restorative justice is a paradigm shift. And so we're shifting from viewing crime as a violation of the law or like a harm against the state, right? So you look at a criminal case, it's always US v. Henry, Henry being the person who's caused harm. We're shifting from viewing crime as a violation of the state to understanding it to be a violation of people and relationships and harms against people that require individual, interpersonal, community, and system-wide accountability and healing. I don't know why my video just turned off.
Okay, there we go.
We
Awesome.
got it?
Yes, we got it. Thank you,
Right.
everyone, for helping us out with that. Yeah, I'm so sorry. Can you go back to the last slide?
Absolutely.
Can you start with that one?
For sure. Okay, so we're winding a little bit. So like I said, so this was basically just a quick recap of the kind of principles of restorative justice that we went over during our last webinar. So basically, we just want to remind people that restorative justice is first and foremost about relationships. So it's about ways that, that we create and nurture and mend those relationships. And so basically, we're in this paradigm shift when we're thinking about harm, shifting from a punitive system to a restorative justice system. Basically, what we're doing is we're shifting from viewing crime as a violation of the law or harm against the state to instead understanding it to be a violation of people and relationships and harms against people that require individual, interpersonal, community, and system-wide accountability and healing. And then as I was saying, we find it really helpful to compare restorative justice to our current criminal legal system, which most people are just more familiar with because we're surrounded by it every day. So, understanding that this is a kind of gross oversimplification of our current criminal legal system and also of restorative justice, we like to say that our current system essentially asks three core questions, right? It asks, what law was broken? Who broke it? And how should they be punished? And so in contrast, restorative justice asks a very different set of questions. It asks, who has been harmed? What do they need? And whose obligation is it to meet those needs? So when you see these two sets of questions side by side, who are we focusing on in our current criminal legal approach? And you can throw those answers in the chat. Who are we focusing on, or who are we centralizing in the criminal legal system?
So it looks like we have answers. Who the person who did the harm, we're focusing on the state, the person who did the harm, the state, harmer, et cetera.
Et cetera. Thank you. Absolutely. And then in comparison, in restorative justice land, who are we focusing on or centralizing?
We have the survivor, victim, all the people affected.
Mm. Absolutely, right. And so the point here basically being that the people that we kind of create or build processes or processes to address harm around will give us very different outcomes and also very different benefits and downsides. So with that, I will hand things over to Erica.
Thanks, Sia. So now, everyone, we're going to transition to our second learning objective. And the second objective really focuses on how we actually design and implement processes that recognize all of what Sia just spoke to, right? So these are processes that will frame justice as a concern for healing in relationship and repairing harm as directly as possible. So of course, that slide that Sia spoke to 2 slides ago really spoke to what it looks like to really address harm and repairing harm as directly as possible to those who have been harmed. And, luckily, we have Indigenous teachers, such as the Maori people of Aotearoa, which is the Maori word for the land that we now know as New Zealand. And they've really provided some beautiful guidance for us. And that's actually guidance that New Zealand's government utilized after a report that it commissioned back in 1988 identified government practices as resulting in a disproportionate number of Maori youth being incarcerated. And I'm sure we can all relate to the findings that they had there when we look at the findings we have here in our own country. And so in response to that report, right, this report by the New Zealand government, the government began using a Maori-inspired restorative process that they called family group conferencing to address youthful wrongdoing. So soon after, right, they started using this conferencing model, they also passed legislation that made family group conferencing the primary way of dealing with harms by children. So they had the report, they recognized what they were doing, they started practicing this way of conferencing cases, and then they passed legislation to make it the primary way of addressing harms by children. And what they found was that it led to a drastic reduction in youth incarceration. And so we are all able to learn from what they did there. And we have learned from what they did there when designing what here we call restorative community conferencing. And that is the model that we work with at Impact Justice. We also, importantly, learned what not to do, because though New Zealand was able to cut youth incarceration significantly, they saw that their disparities really persisted and even grew. And so I will be discussing later in this presentation how our model really ensures that we do not see that result. And you can take me to the next slide, Sia. Thank you. So before I do, though, I wanted to offer this infographic, which illustrates how our model diverts a responsible youth or responsible person out of the legal system and into a restorative justice process. So I'm going to walk us through what's depicted here so you all get a sense of the process. And it starts with a crime being committed, because this is a diversion program that diverts cases from the system. It starts with the crime. And for this program, that means that a high-level misdemeanor or a felony crime with an identifiable person harmed has been committed, and that the person who is responsible for that crime, so you'll see like a little stick figure-ish person that looks like their arms are outstretched and in movement, that person is then, when they make contact with the system, they are then diverted, and we use 3 off-ramps. So we've depicted here 3 off-ramps that can be used to divert that individual out of the system. And we see here, right, we see it could happen by police at the point of arrest. It can happen by probation and by the district attorney's office. And so either one of those off ramps is utilized to remove that young person from the system and to a community-based organization that holds the restorative justice diversion program for that community. And importantly, right, the off ramp is always removing people before the system actually charges them with the crime. So these are pre-charge off ramps from the system. And where that happens, you know, be it the police, probation, the DA's office, or elsewhere, really depends on the circumstances in that specific county. But moving along, right, this responsible person is diverted and then agrees, as does the person harmed, to take part in the restorative justice process. And so what that then triggers is a period that we call preparation. It's not depicted here specifically, but it is a period where each person, so the person who was harmed, the person who did the harm, as well as loved ones and community members, work separately with restorative justice facilitators to really process what happened, the causes, as well as the impact of the harm. And only then, right, when everyone is adequately prepared, is everyone brought together, and that is the restorative community conference, right? And so you see like the blue cloud, that's where the conference is located on this infographic. And so what that means is that they all engage in a face-to-face dialogue, right? So the person harmed, the responsible person, supporters for both, and community members speak face-to-face in order to discuss the harm and to co-create a plan for healing. And the way that our programs work, that plan should really aim to do 4 things. So the plan is supposed to repair the harm to the person who's been harmed. It is supposed to repair the harm to the community, repair the harm to the young person's family or support system, and repair the harm to the young person themselves. And that plan also uses what we call SMART criteria. I'm sure you may have seen that used in various segments, but for us, that means it is specific, it's measurable, it's achievable, it's restorative, and it's time bound. And so when the plan is completed, and so you'll see, moving along that line, it ultimately results in no charges being filed with regards to that case that's been diverted. And luckily, hopefully we then disrupt what we know is a cycle of incarceration. So that's the process that we train our community-based organizations to facilitate for individuals diverted to their programs. And you can move us along.
Thanks, Erica. Okay, so in working with this model for a number of years as a team, we have spent a ton of time thinking and talking with folks and doing research on what makes a restorative justice diversion program successful and transformative. And so we've landed on these 8 core elements that you see up on the screen that we think are really critical for any restorative justice diversion program. So Erica and I are going to take a little bit of time to kind of really walk through each of these. So the first core element is oriented around the needs of people harmed. So we believe and recognize that people harmed have the right to define what justice and healing looks like to them, right? And so because of that understanding and recognition, people harmed drive this process. And so survivors, for instance, identify the needs resulting from the harm that they have experienced. And since everyone is different and unique, these needs are also different and unique, right? So we can't take a one-size-fits-all approach to healing harm like the current criminal legal system does. So oftentimes people ask, can you give us an example of a reparative plan that has come out of one of these restorative justice diversion processes? And I mean, the answer is yes, we could, but in explaining the particular harm and the reparative plan, someone not involved in that harm might think, oh, that's not enough. But the reality again is that all survivors are different, and so what people need in order to heal is going to be different. And so what might not seem quote unquote enough to one person might be enough to the person who actually experienced the harm. And so basically those survivor identified needs are, to the extent possible, built into the plan for the responsible person to make things right. So again, this is really a process of just recognizing someone has been harmed here and they have needs, and how do we really rally around them and support them as a community and getting many of those needs met as possible.
Awesome. So element 2 of our model, our programs are structured to address racial and ethnic disparities in order to end BIPOC criminalization. And hopefully this and a number of the other elements that we're going to go into will address some of the questions that I saw coming in when I was discussing the process. But really this element gets to what I think probably many of us on this call appreciate, and what also was seen in Aotearoa, which is that youth diversion programs so often fail to reach the communities that are most impacted by our harmful criminal legal system, right? And so recognizing that, we want to keep racial and ethnic disparities, or RED, at the forefront of how we build and implement these programs. And so for us, right, recognizing this real focus on addressing racial and ethnic disparities, the jurisdictions that we partner with create referral criteria by asking which offenses are youth of color disproportionately arrested for, right, arrested or incarcerated for, and where are youth of color disproportionately contacting the system. So which offenses and where is it happening? And then we bake the case types that are identified and the zip codes into the referral criteria for these programs. And this, of course, like, is in addition to all of what, many studies have been published to help inform how we do diversion in this country, right? Some of the recommendations that they make, which include, removing restrictions for prior criminal history. That's also something that our programs have, as well as ensuring that participation is always free. And all of this, right, allows us to do our best to really interrupt the cyclical nature of disparities, where, if you are from a certain neighborhood or certain community, you are more likely to be surveilled. And once surveilled, you're more likely to be stopped, more likely to be arrested, more likely to be convicted, more likely to be sentenced heavily, on and on, right? This is the cyclical nature of disparities. And it's a powerful, powerful tide. And so we are looking to disrupt it. And in order to disrupt it, we have to apply all of the power that we can. And so this is what we bake into how we implement these models, these programs, and which cases are prioritized as far as diversion to these programs. You can take me to the next slide. Thanks.
Okay, so our next element is that this is an exclusively pre-charged diversion approach. So we believe that restorative justice diversion programs should only divert cases pre-charge in order to minimize interaction with the system for both the responsible person, but then also the person harmed. So basically what all of this essentially means is that a prosecutor sends the case to a community-based organization before ever charging anyone with the crime. And so I know there's a question in the chat about pre-charge versus pre-arrest. There are some sites that we're working with that are doing pre-arrest, that are preparing to launch actually a pre-arrest approach. It really kind of just depends on what is currently kind of possible legally in each site. But our goal really, honestly, is to work towards, supporting communities where no one calls the police in the first place. And when harm happens in a neighborhood, in a community, instead of someone calling the police or even engaging the state, They instead call their local community-based organization, and they're able to directly divert that harm straight to their community-based organization. But just kind of in terms of a pre-charge approach, we believe that this is ideal for a number of reasons. We could go on about this for hours, but basically just to name a few, the more involved someone is in the criminal legal system, the more negative psychological and legal consequences there are as a result of that involvement. And then also, people, especially people of color, especially Black and brown folks, are less likely to feel comfortable telling the truth and being vulnerable once they have been charged with a crime and given a defense attorney who will likely and understandably advise them not to admit guilt, and different things like that. And then there are also a number of benefits to survivors, especially survivors who are reluctant to cooperate or engage with the legal system. And also, we believe that by doing this approach pre-charge, it's really putting the needs of survivors up front. So this isn't a process where the state steps in and charges someone and then kind of as an afterthought says, okay, survivor, you can go have, this little process that you would like to engage in. This is instead really prioritizing, again, the needs of survivors. Again, especially those who aren't interested in involving the state in their harm, in addressing their harm. And then this also keeps the ability to resolve conflicts in the hands of the community, which is really best suited to create spaces that feel safe and conducive to healing, especially given our criminal legal system's really fraught and just completely damaging and negative relationship with communities, especially communities of color, just throughout the history of our country's existence. Back to you, Erica.
Thanks, yeah. So element 4, right? So these programs are structured to prevent net widening. And what this means is essentially we are doing what we can to avoid over programming people. And this is really, based on a number of concerns, but we know that there are studies that show that essentially that bringing people deeper into this system and the system's net instead of freeing them from it occurs when we over program people who really do not need that programming. And so this model of restorative justice diversion really is an intense process. And when the intensity, what we have seen, right, is that when the intensity of an intervention is disproportionate to the harm, it can actually lead to an increase in recidivism. And so what do we do about it, right? We essentially say, and what our programs are currently doing is that only felonies and high-level misdemeanors that would have resulted in incarceration or probation are eligible to be diverted to these programs. And, just as critical as trying to really divert these more serious case types is that these are cases that have an identifiable crime survivor. So that would be, your assaults or robberies, burglaries, right? These are the kinds of harms that restorative justice diversion is most successful at addressing. And it's another thing, right, as well as looking at the zip codes and the case types. We also look at these types of harms, right? Identify these types of harms with identifiable crime survivors. And all of that is baked into the agreement with the system partner as far as which cases are going to be diverted to this type of a program. So, what this does is that it allows the person who caused harm to connect what they did to the emotional, physical, and psychological impact on the survivor. And, to me, it's intuitive, but it's also reflected in studies. Studies are consistently showing that restorative justice is most effective at addressing recidivism when it is used for violent crimes with identifiable survivors rather than property crimes. And I'm sure there are a number of you on this call, on this webinar, who have seen studies that really are not showing restorative justice programs to be very effective. And what I have seen consistently is that a lot of the case types that are being sent to those programs are not appropriate for this type of an intervention. And apart from, of course, the impact that we're seeing on recidivism, and in a second, we're going to get into what we're seeing with regards to our specific programs. Having an identifiable participating survivor has been shown to decrease their perceived likelihood of re-victimization, to decrease anxiety, increase their sense of security, increase their feelings of self-confidence and self-worth, increase sympathy for the person who did harm, for their loved ones and supporters, right? There are all of these incredible benefits for the survivors. And so making sure that they're involved in this process is really important. And to put that in medical terms, right? Like all of this speaks to post-traumatic stress symptoms, and then post-traumatic stress symptoms speak to an increased risk of coronary disease, drug abuse and alcohol abuse, diabetes, it goes on and on. I sometimes say, and I've heard said, harm begets harm while healing begets healing. And restorative justice diversion is really looking to create a space to feel hurt so we don't transmit hurt. And with that, I think we can take it to the next one.
Great. So our fifth element is that this is a strengths-based approach to healing harm. So as Brian Stevenson very famously said, we are all so much more than the worst thing that we've ever done. And so our team also adds to that we're also so much more than the worst thing that has ever happened to us. And so our model essentially leads from that understanding. So while we definitely believe that people sometimes do bad things, we've all done bad things, we don't believe that there are quote unquote bad people or people that are disposable or kind of beyond redemption or beyond repair. So we have basically kind of, based on all of that understanding, we have shifted the approach from focusing on what's quote unquote wrong with the person who's caused harm to what's really right with them, right? And so we train program facilitators at the community-based organizations in the sites that are actually running these programs to approach interactions with participants from a strengths-based perspective by finding out what skills they have or qualities they're proud of, and then finding ways for the response to harm to uplift those strengths, right? So let's say there's a survivor who really loves art, and let's say that there's, the person who has harmed them is kind of a budding artist. Maybe there's a way for that budding artist to kind of be paired with people in the community, artists, community-based artists in the community. And maybe there's a way for them to kind of really build on those skills of being a young budding artist in order to help, to repair the harm to the person that they've harmed. So I will end there and hand it back to you, Erica.
Thanks, element 6, these programs are rooted in relationships. And so we really can't say this enough. We've already said it a lot anyways, but building, mending, maintaining relationships is really at the heart of how we conceive of justice, and therefore, right, how we design these programs. Science affirms that that trusting, loving relationships add, I think the last thing I saw was like 15 years on average to your life. Relationships are critical. And because of that, right, we really train facilitators to see relationship building as the bedrock of their work. So they're trained to really take the time that they need to build trust and to deepen relationships with those who are involved in the process. And as a result, right, that deepens their insight into the participants as human beings, right? And by extension into the harm and its impacts. So I also just would note, right, what I spoke to earlier about the plan that comes out of this process. It is one that is that is designed to heal relationships, right? The relationship between the responsible person and their loved ones, the relationship with the community, the relationship with the person who has been harmed most directly, and the relationship that we each have with ourselves. So this is all rooted in relationships, how we heal them, how we strengthen them, how we build them. And that is seen throughout the processes that we train communities to implement. And we can go to the next one.
Awesome. So our second to last element is around protecting participant confidentiality. So, in the legal system, people are told that anything they say can and will be used against them, right? That's literally written into our Miranda rights, that, folks who've had contact with the system or even have just seen movies or shows, we're all familiar with. And so this is a very clear threat. And that threat of prosecution is a clear barrier to truth telling. And so with that in mind, we've kind of developed a reverse Miranda protection for restorative justice diversion. So we require all of the district attorney offices in the sites that we work in to sign a memorandum of understanding, or an MOU, essentially agreeing that any information anyone shares, any information any of the participants share during any part of the restorative justice diversion process is confidential and cannot be used against anyone in any future court proceedings. And so therefore, by removing that threat of, if you say the wrong thing or if you say too much, you're going to be prosecuted or sued later. We also ask participants to sign a similar kind of confidentiality agreement before going into that reparative conference, that restorative conference. By removing that threat, it really kind of creates a safe space and a safe container for people to talk openly and honestly and fully about everything that they did and all of the harm that they've caused. Yeah, back to you, Erica.
Thanks, yeah. Okay, so our last element, and we'll hopefully move through everything else quickly because I know we want to have time for questions, but our last element, very important, restorative justice diversion programs are created and held by community and community-based organizations. So we firmly believe that restorative justice really must be born in community, not brought to community. And so community identified needs and direction setting, right, from conceptualization through program expansion is critical. For us, being held by community means that restorative justice processes function best and are in alignment with the values and the goals of restorative justice when they operate outside of the legal system. And, this is from that recognition that the relationships that bind families and communities together are really what power restorative justice processes. Also, of course, communities have a better understanding of conflict and needs and should be resourced with this tool to address those conflicts, both from those diverted from the system and those that do not touch the system at all. And therefore, we at Impact Justice, we work with community-based organizations that, amongst other things, are trusted by the community and community members, that have leadership and staff who share experiences with program participants, that have a power with, not a power over relationship with the community, and many other factors. And so it is really critical. It's critical with how this work can be done and the results that we're seeing at the various sites where we're in partnership. And if you take me to the next slide, Sia, I can talk more about where we're in partnership. Awesome. So here are the counties where this model of restorative justice diversion is operating or in development. And there are more in the works that aren't depicted here. But these sites are, yes, in relationship with us as their training and technical assistance providers, but they're also in relationship with one another as members of our growing national cohort. And those relationships truly add such value to the work that each of these community-based organizations, right, is doing in their respective counties. So they share lessons, they can troubleshoot difficulties, brainstorm both with us and without us present. And, it is a it is a really beautiful web of relationships supporting one another to do this work across the country. And if you take me to the next one, awesome. So, excitingly, we have seen some pretty wonderful results. The results on the left were published by the San Francisco County District Attorney's Office about the program there. So their program is called Make It Right. And the results show, right, that youth who completed the program were 4 times less likely to recidivate after 2 years, so 24 months, when compared to youth who did not go through the program. And so the recidivism rate, the recidivism rate for youth in the program was 13% versus 53% for youth who went through the traditional system. And for this study, youth were matched with a control group based on race, gender, age, offense, and priors. And it also showed that youth, importantly, who did not participate in the program recidivated much sooner. So within about 9 months on average, compared to on average about 2 years for youth who went through the program and did ultimately end up committing a harm for which a petition was filed. And so then the second graphic, right, on the one on the right, is from a study of the Alameda County program, so that's Oakland, and that shows a cost of approximately $4,500 per year per youth who go through the process, and that's compared to $23,000 per year per youth who go through traditional juvenile legal prosecution. So, right, essentially what this shows is that this process cuts recidivism and it cuts cost. And in my humble opinion, it's also just the right thing to do. And if you go to the next slide, Sia, further findings, right? Like we focus a lot on recidivism, but and costs, but we really, for the programs where we work, we are looking to gather a lot more information that is really important. And so these are findings from the Oakland program, the Alameda County program, and it shows that youth report high satisfaction with the program and indicate that their participation has had a significantly positive impact on their relationships with their families, on their ability to deal with conflict, on their communication skills, etc. And though I don't believe, it's not really reflected here, but caregivers themselves report similar findings about their youth. And if you take me to the next one, Sia, thank you. So this is also data collected from the Alameda County RJD program, and it shows a 91% satisfaction rate among people harmed who go through this program. And so there's also the same percentage that say that they would recommend the process to a friend. And this is measured through post-conference surveys, right, that are given following every restorative community conference. And I think, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Perfect. So this is our last slide. Okay, so we know that I think that there have already been some questions about, how do I actually, get a pre-charge restorative justice diversion program up and running in my community, right? And so we have a number of kind of like initial thoughts and next steps. So you can host listening sessions and speak with your community about pre-charge restorative justice diversion. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our site shortly. So, absolutely please use this recording to help guide your conversations with different folks in your community. You can also begin to lay the groundwork for establishing a restorative justice diversion program in your community by using our restorative justice diversion toolkit, which I am so excited about. You can access that at rjdtoolkit.org. We published this a little over about a year, maybe a year and a half ago. And it's the first ever completely free, publicly accessible, step-by-step guide for communities to begin to kind of, again, lay that groundwork for establishing a pre-charge restorative justice diversion program to respond to serious harm. So it has a number of worksheets and steps, even like sample agendas for meeting with your system partners, sample, kind of rubrics for identifying a community-based organization to actually hold this work. It's a really incredible resource. So I really encourage all of you to, when you have a chance, if you care to, go ahead and take a look at that website. And then finally, please, 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 this is the second of a series of 3 webinars that we're putting on. So please register for our April 13th webinar. We will drop the link to register for that in the chat. And that webinar will basically be an overview of our RJD toolkit and to really walk people through, kind of give people a sense of how best to use that toolkit. And again, that toolkit essentially kind of walks you through those initial steps of identifying a community-based organization if you haven't already, meeting with system partners, getting buy-in from system partners, getting a memorandum of understanding signed, getting initial data from system partners, really getting you up into that point until those community-based organizations need to get trained before you can actually launch a pilot. I know we only have 5 minutes left, and that's kind of not really enough time for questions, but we will do our best. So I will stop sharing my screen. Bree has been amazing at just pulling all of your questions from the chat. So I'm just going to jump in. So the first question that I've highlighted is, how do you get reluctant parents or families to participate in, in this process? And I'm happy to take this one. So basically, there's a ton of prep work that happens before people who have caused harm and people who have been harmed are ever brought into a conference. And so facilitators spend a ton of time working with participants to identify their support system, right? A ton of time basically asking, who are the people in your life that really encourage and support you to be your best self? And who are the people that you would feel comfortable being at this conference with you and supporting you, both as the person who's caused harm and also as the person harmed. And that doesn't necessarily have to be your parents or your family members, right? Some people have chosen family that are closer to them than their blood relatives. And so those are the people that facilitators really encourage people to invite to a conference. The next question that I pulled out is, what if the person harmed does not want to participate in restorative justice? Erica, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I can take that one. And then I might try to touch on I saw a lot about pre-charge, post-charge. So yeah, if the person harmed does not want to participate, of course, this is a, voluntary process that they can choose to participate in or not. We often, we train facilitators the first question is, how have you been harmed? Or can we set you up with other resources in the community? Like, how are your kids doing after that happened? It's not, do you want to meet with somebody tomorrow, this person who did this thing, right? It's really like, what are the various ways that we can support you? And as we start to identify all of how we are harmed, right? Like, whether, again, psychologically, emotionally, questions that this survivor may raise in those initial conversations with a facilitator, that if they get to the point of feeling comfortable, they can then have those questions answered at a restorative community conference. Now, if they are never comfortable actually engaging, then we use surrogates. So surrogates that have hopefully experienced similar harms and are willing to take part, or the person who has been harmed identifies a family member, someone who really knows the impact that incident had on them and can participate maybe in their absence. Maybe the person who was harmed writes a letter where they talk about the impact. We are creative and flexible. But of course, the goal is for the person harmed to identify the needs that they have and to see how some of those needs could be met through this process. So, there were a number on pre-charge, pre-arrest, post-charge, and we right now we are working with community-based organizations that can operate, in partnership with the district attorney's offices or police departments pre-charge diversion. So some, like Sia said, are actually operating pre-arrest, but largely that's post-arrest pre-charge. And, there are a number of reasons for that. Sia spoke to a few. Of course, we have been collecting data on these programs. These programs have been pre-charge, and we are showing success from that model. We are looking to avoid the collateral consequences of a formal charge on an individual's record. We want to be responsive to survivors that have no interest in engaging with the system. We want participation by the BIPOC community, which we believe increases as system involvement decreases. We want to limit fear of admitting responsibility, hopefully decrease coerciveness and costs involved with having attorneys being assigned post-charge. And this is a completely different system than the adversarial space that is our criminal legal processes. And so, trying to peel away that criminal legal system from conflicts is what we are very committed to doing. And to also, take advantage of funding that right now would be used to operate both systems, to exist in combination with one another in what we see as both damaging and unnecessary, to have that funding actually be able to be utilized for really robust programs that address conflict restoratively. So all of that goes into why we really hold that line with regards to these programs. And we have seen many system partners who recognize the importance of that line and are willing to hold it with us.
Thanks, Erica. And I know we're out of time, and there've been so many amazing questions that I'm just like, I need 5 more hours with you all. I'm gonna say 3 more things, and then I promise we'll let you go. The first one, there have been questions about youth versus adults. So we believe that this is a model that is amazing for people of all ages. Most sites do kind of start to work in the juvenile system, mainly just honestly because I think young people are more sympathetic, and so it's easier to get that buy-in from system partners. But this is a really great model, again, for people of all ages. There's a question about examples for kinds of felonies and misdemeanors that might be addressed. Really, the 2 main requirements here is that there be an identifiable survivor, and that the person responsible admit responsibility or be willing to take responsibility. So burglaries, assaults, car thefts, robberies, even sexual harm, even up through murder. This is a really great process. And then the last point I wanted to make, there was a question about kind of wraparound services and community resources, and kind of to follow up in that reparative plan. I might be summarizing a little bit quickly, sorry. But really just wanted to make the point that harm does not happen in a vacuum, right? And there's a whole host of historical and societal factors that contribute to harm, right? And so because of that, there's really also this kind of external, additional, really important need for folks to organize around really addressing those kind of underlying causes that really contribute and kind of create the conditions for people to cause harm in the first place. That would be really amazing. I will end there. Thank you all so much for joining us. This was really great. Erica, I don't know if you have any last thoughts before we sign off.
No, I wish we could have gotten to more questions, but please check out the resources that Sia spoke to on that last slide. There's so many of the questions are answered in the toolkit.
Awesome, thank you all.